Sarah Martinez pushed her shopping cart through the grocery store aisles, her 8-year-old son Tommy walking beside her, chattering excitedly about his upcoming baseball game. She smiled at his enthusiasm, remembering when life felt that simple and carefree. At 32, Sarah had built what she considered a perfectly ordinary life in the suburbs of Denver. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, volunteered at Tommy's school, and spent her evenings helping with homework and reading bedtime stories. Nobody in their quiet neighborhood knew about the woman Sarah used to be. The transformation had been deliberate and complete. Gone were the days when she could disassemble and reassemble an assault rifle in under 30 seconds, or when she could navigate through hostile territory using only the stars for guidance. That person felt like someone from another lifetime, buried beneath years of PDA meetings, soccer practices, and client presentations. Sarah had met David, Tommy's father, at a coffee shop 3 years after leaving the military. She had been working on rebuilding herself, learning how to exist in civilian life, when his gentle smile and easy laugh drew her in. David was a high school teacher, passionate about literature, and completely removed from the world of combat and conflict that had defined Sarah's 20s. When Tommy came along, Sarah made a conscious decision to leave her past exactly where it belonged, in the past. The grocery store was busier than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah navigated through clusters of other shoppers, keeping one eye on Tommy as he occasionally wandered toward displays that caught his attention. She had learned to be constantly aware of her surroundings, though she told herself it was just normal parental vigilance, not the hyper-awareness that had kept her alive during 6 years of active duty. As they approached the checkout lanes, Tommy tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, can we get the cereal with the toy inside?" He pointed toward a colorful display near the front of the store. Sarah glanced at her watch. They had plenty of time before David got home from school. "All right, but just this once," she said, ruffling his dark hair that looked so much like his father's. "Go grab it, but stay where I can see you." Tommy bounded off toward the cereal display with the kind of boundless energy that only 8-year-olds possessed. Sarah watched him carefully examine each box, probably looking for the one with the best toy. She turned back to load her groceries onto the conveyor belt, feeling content with the peaceful rhythm of their afternoon. The screaming started suddenly. Sarah's head snapped up at the sound of Tommy's terrified voice calling for her. Her body reacted before her mind fully processed what was happening, every muscle tensing as years of training kicked in despite her attempts to suppress them. She abandoned her cart and moved swiftly toward the commotion, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Tommy backed against the cereal display, tears streaming down his face, while a man towered over him. The man was large, probably 6'3" and heavily built, wearing a stained jacket that reeked of alcohol even from several feet away. His face was flushed with anger and intoxication, and he was shouting at Tommy with a level of rage that seemed completely disproportionate to whatever had triggered it. "You little brat knocked into me," the man yelled, his words slurred but his aggression crystal clear. "Where are your parents? Someone needs to teach you some manners." Sarah quickly assessed the situation as she approached. The man was clearly intoxicated, unsteady on his feet, but still dangerous due to his size and unpredictable state. Tommy was frightened, but appeared unharmed. Other shoppers had begun to notice the commotion, but most were keeping their distance, unsure how to intervene. "Excuse me," Sarah said calmly, stepping between the man and her son. "I'm his mother. I'm sure if he bumped into you, it was just an accident." The man's bloodshot eyes focused on her with difficulty, and his expression shifted from anger to something that made Sarah's skin crawl. A predatory smile spread across his face as he looked her up and down in a way that made her feel exposed and threatened. Well, he said, swaying slightly as he spoke. "Maybe we can work something out, sweetheart. Your boy here owes me an apology, and maybe you owe me something too." Sarah felt Tommy grab onto the back of her shirt, his small hands trembling. She reached back to touch his arm reassuringly, while keeping her eyes locked on the threat in front of them. The man stepped closer, invading her personal space deliberately, and She could smell the alcohol on his breath mixed with something else. Unwashed clothes and stale cigarettes. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "We don't want any trouble. If my son accidentally bumped into you, I apologize. We'll just be on our way now." But the man had no intention of letting them leave. As Sarah began to guide Tommy away, the man grabbed her arm with enough force to leave bruises. His grip was tight and deliberate, and the look in his eyes had shifted to something darker and more dangerous. "I don't think you heard me," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only she could hear. "Your boy disrespected me, and now you're being rude too. I think you both need to learn some lessons about showing proper respect." Sarah looked around quickly, noting that while other shoppers were watching with concern, none seemed prepared to intervene. The store security guard was nowhere to be seen, and she realized that she and Tommy were essentially on their own. The man's grip on her arm tightened, and she could feel his fingers digging into her flesh through her sweater. Behind her, Tommy whispered, "Mommy, I'm scared." The sound of her child's frightened voice triggered something deep within Sarah that she had worked hard to keep buried. For years, she had successfully suppressed the warrior that military training had forged within her, choosing instead to embrace the role of suburban mother and wife. But as this stranger's hands violated her personal space and threatened her child, that carefully constructed facade began to crack. The man leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear, as he spoke words that made her blood run cold. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private. I bet a pretty little thing like you could make up for your boy's rudeness in all sorts of interesting ways." Sarah's world narrowed to a single, crystal-clear focus. Every sense sharpened, every muscle prepared for action, and every instinct honed by years of combat training came flooding back. She was no longer Sarah Martinez, suburban mom and graphic designer. In that moment, she was once again Petty Officer Sarah Chun, Navy SEAL, and someone had just made the fatal mistake of threatening her child. The transformation was internal but complete. Her breathing steadied, her heart rate actually began to slow despite the danger, and her mind started calculating angles, distances, and the most efficient ways to neutralize the threat while ensuring Tommy's safety. She had hoped never to need these skills again, but now she was grateful for every brutal hour of training that had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that would have been recognizable to anyone who had served under her command, "I'm going to ask you one more time to let go of my arm and step away from my son." The man laughed, clearly interpreting her calm demeanor as fear or submission. He had no way of knowing that he was looking into the eyes of someone who had survived firefights in 3 different countries, who had been trained to kill with everything from high-powered rifles to her bare hands, and who was currently calculating exactly how long it would take to disable him without causing permanent damage. "Or what, sweetheart?" he sneered, his grip tightening even more. "What's a little thing like you going to do about it?" Sarah looked back at Tommy one more time, seeing the trust and terror in his young eyes. She had spent 8 years building a life where violence had no place, where conflicts were resolved with words, and compromise, where the solution to problems didn't involve the precise application of force. But sometimes, despite all efforts to avoid it, violence found you anyway. "Tommy," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made her son immediately pay attention despite his fear, "I need you to go stand by the customer service desk right now. Don't look back, and don't come over here no matter what happens until I come get you. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded quickly, recognizing something in his mother's voice that he had never heard before, but somehow knew meant he should obey without question. As he hurried toward the front of the store, Sarah turned her full attention back to the man who still held her arm in his painful grip. The last fragments of suburban mother Sarah Martinez disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who had earned her place among America's most elite warriors through years of training that broke most people who attempted it. The man holding her arm was about to discover that he had chosen the wrong woman to threaten, and the wrong child to frighten. The quiet grocery store was about to become a battlefield, and only one person present was truly prepared for what was about to happen. Hashtag the unleashing the man's mistake was assuming that Sarah's small stature and calm demeanor meant she was helpless. At 5'4" and 120 pounds, she looked like exactly what she had spent years pretending to be. An ordinary suburban mother who posed no threat to anyone. But appearances, as he was about to learn, could be devastatingly deceptive. Sarah's response was swift, precise, and absolutely devastating in its efficiency. Years of muscle memory kicked in as she executed a move she had practiced thousands of times during her military training. She twisted her captured arm in a specific way that used the man's own grip against him, simultaneously stepping into his space and driving her elbow upward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact drove all the air from his lungs in a single, explosive whoosh. Before he could react or even fully understand what had happened, Sarah had spun behind him, using his momentary disorientation to position herself where she held every advantage. Her arms snaked around his neck in a blood choke that she could maintain indefinitely while keeping herself safely away from his flailing arms. "Listen very carefully," she whispered in his ear, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that came from years of commanding troops in life-or-death situations. "You have about 10 seconds before you pass out. I'm going to release you, and when I do, you're going to walk out of this store and never come back. If you ever come near my son again, if you ever threaten another woman or child, I will find you. And next time, I won't be nearly so gentle." The man clawed desperately at her arm, but Sarah's position was perfect, and her grip was unbreakable. She had been trained by the best close-quarters combat instructors in the world, and this hold was designed to subdue much larger, stronger opponents. His struggles only served to exhaust him more quickly. Around them, the grocery store had gone completely silent. Other shoppers stood frozen, watching in shock as the small woman they might have passed in the parking lot without a second thought demonstrated a level of physical capability that seemed to defy logic. Some pulled out their phones, though whether to call for help or record the encounter, Sarah couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. She could feel the exact moment when the man's struggles began to weaken as the blood flow to his brain decreased. Her training had taught her to monitor these signs carefully. Too little pressure, and the hold would be ineffective. Too much, and it could cause permanent damage or death. Even in this moment of protective fury, Sarah maintained the precise control that had made her one of the most respected operatives in her unit. 5 seconds, she said quietly, and released the hold. The man stumbled forward, gasping and coughing as blood flow returned to his brain. He spun around to face Sarah, his eyes now showing a mixture of rage, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine fear. He outweighed her by at least 80 pounds and stood nearly a foot taller, but something in her posture and the way she watched him suggested that these physical advantages might not matter as much as he had assumed. "You crazy bitch," he snarled, though his voice was hoarse and his stance was less confident than it had been moments before. "I'll have you arrested for assault." Sarah stood perfectly still, her body relaxed, but ready to respond to any threat. To an untrained observer, she might have looked almost casual, but anyone with military experience would have recognized the stance of someone prepared to unleash devastating violence at a moment's notice. "You grabbed me first," she said calmly, loud enough that the gathered crowd could hear clearly. "I was defending myself and my child from an intoxicated man who was making threats. I'm sure all these witnesses would be happy to confirm that." She gestured slightly toward the other shoppers, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The man looked around and seemed to realize for the first time that his behavior had been witnessed by dozens of people, all of whom would undoubtedly support Sarah's version of events if police became involved. But he wasn't quite ready to concede defeat. Years of bullying smaller, weaker people had convinced him that intimidation and physical presence were usually enough to get what he wanted. He had never encountered someone who possessed both the skill and the will to fight back effectively. I don't know what kind of lucky shot that was, he said, taking a step closer to Sarah. But it won't happen again. Maybe I should teach you a proper lesson about disrespecting your betters. Sarah sighed internally. Some people simply couldn't learn from experience, and it appeared this man was determined to escalate the situation despite having already been thoroughly outclassed. She had hoped that the demonstration of her capabilities would be enough to end the confrontation, but it seemed that more convincing was required. "Sir," she said, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to address soldiers under her command who were about to make career-ending mistakes, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your next action. Walk away now, and this ends here. Continue down this path, and I promise you will regret it." The man's response was to lunge forward, apparently convinced that his size and gender gave him an insurmountable advantage regardless of what had happened moments before. It was exactly the kind of predictable, testosterone-driven reaction that Sarah's instructors had taught her to expect from untrained opponents who relied on intimidation rather than skill. What happened next unfolded so quickly that most of the witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. The man's forward momentum was redirected using his own weight and speed against him. Sarah stepped aside at precisely the right moment, grabbed his extended arm, and used a combination of leverage and his own forward motion to send him crashing into the cereal display he had originally been blocking. Boxes of cereal exploded in all directions as his body impacted the metal shelving with tremendous force. The sound of the collision echoed through the store, followed by the crash and clatter of dozens of cereal boxes hitting the floor. The man groaned and tried to push himself up from the wreckage, but his movements were uncoordinated and weak. Sarah stood over him, completely calm despite having just demonstrated a level of combat effectiveness that would have impressed her former commanding officers. She wasn't even breathing hard, and her clothes weren't even disheveled. To the casual observer, it might have looked like the man had simply tripped and fallen into the display on his own. "Stay down," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly in the stunned silence of the store. "Security is on the way, and you're already in enough trouble without making things worse." Indeed, she could see the store's security guard finally approaching, along with what appeared to be the manager. They were moving cautiously, clearly uncertain about what they were walking into, but recognizing that they needed to intervene. Sarah turned slightly to keep both the man on the ground and the approaching store employees in her field of vision. The security guard was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who looked like he had been hired more for his availability than his qualifications. He approached with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had never dealt with anything more serious than shoplifting and was completely out of his depth with the current situation. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly, "we're going to need you to step away from him." Sarah nodded and took several steps back, raising her hands slightly to show that she wasn't holding anything and posed no immediate threat. "Of course," she said politely. "This man grabbed me and threatened both me and my child. I was defending myself." The store manager, a middle-aged woman with the harried look of someone who dealt with difficult customers on a daily basis, looked between Sarah and the man who was still struggling to get up from the destroyed cereal display. The evidence of what had transpired was written all over the scene, and it wasn't difficult to determine who had been the aggressor. "Are you hurt?" the manager asked Sarah, genuine concern in her voice. "I am fine," Sarah replied, "but I like to make sure my son is okay." This man frightened him badly. She looked toward the customer service desk, where Tommy stood with one of the store employees, his eyes wide as he watched the aftermath of the confrontation. Even from a distance, she could see that he was shaken, but unharmed. The employee who had taken charge of him was a grandmother type who was clearly trying to distract him from the drama unfolding across the store. The man on the ground finally managed to push himself into a sitting position, leaning heavily against the damaged shelving. His face was pale, and he looked dazed from his impact with the display. When he spoke, his voice was much quieter and less confident than it had been earlier. "She attacked me," he said weakly, though even he seemed to recognize how unconvincing this sounded given the circumstances. "After you grabbed her and threatened her child, said an elderly man who had witnessed the entire encounter. I saw the whole thing. That woman was just protecting herself and her boy. Several other shoppers nodded in agreement, and Sarah realized that she had no shortage of witnesses who would support her version of events. The man seemed to realize this as well, because his shoulders sagged in defeat as he looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that someone had called the police, which Sarah had expected. She was prepared to explain her actions to law enforcement, though she hoped to avoid having to reveal too much about her background. The last thing she wanted was for her military service to become public knowledge in her quiet suburban community. As they waited for the police to arrive, Sarah allowed herself a moment to check on Tommy. She walked over to the customer service desk, where her son immediately ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked, looking up at her with eyes that held a mixture of concern and something that might have been awe. "You were really scary for a minute." Sarah hugged him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and feeling her heart rate finally begin to return to normal. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do to keep the people they love safe. Tommy nodded solemnly, though she could tell he didn't fully understand what had just happened. That was probably for the best. There would be time later to explain things in age-appropriate terms, but for now, she just wanted to hold him and remind herself why she had been willing to reveal skills she had hoped never to use again. The police arrived within minutes, their presence adding an official gravity to the situation that made it clear this was no longer just a store disturbance. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to answer their questions, hoping that she could satisfy their curiosity without having to delve too deeply into exactly how a suburban mother had acquired the skills to single-handedly neutralize a much larger opponent. But as she watched the officers approach, she realized that her carefully constructed civilian identity had just sustained its first major crack. The secret she had guarded so carefully for nearly a decade was no longer entirely safe. The questions begin. Officer Martinez walked through the grocery store, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had responded to hundreds of disturbance calls. What he found, however, was unlike anything he had encountered in his 8 years of police work. The destruction was minimal but telling. A collapsed cereal display, scattered boxes, and a large man sitting against the shelving looking like he had been hit by a truck. Standing nearby was a small woman who appeared completely unruffled despite allegedly being at the center of the confrontation. The disparity between the apparent victim and the supposed aggressor immediately caught his attention. Officer Martinez had seen his share of domestic disputes, bar fights, and random acts of violence, but he had never seen a situation where someone Sarah's size had apparently single-handedly neutralized someone nearly twice her weight without sustaining any visible injuries herself. "I'm Officer Martinez," he said, approaching Sarah with the professional courtesy he extended to all potential victims. "I understand there was an altercation here. Are you injured?" "No, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm fine. The man over there grabbed me and made threats toward both me and my son. I defended myself." Officer Martinez noted the way she spoke, clear, direct, and without the emotional overlay he typically expected from someone who had just been through a traumatic experience. There was something almost military in her bearing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was triggering that impression. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" he asked, pulling out his notepad. Sarah recounted the events in a precise, chronological manner that impressed the officer with its clarity and attention to detail. She described the man's intoxication, his initial aggression toward Tommy, the escalation when she intervened, and his physical assault when she attempted to leave with her son. Her account was corroborated by multiple witnesses who eagerly volunteered their observations. "And then what did you do?" Officer Martinez asked, though he was beginning to suspect that this part of the story would be the most interesting. "I defended myself," Sarah said simply. "I used minimal force necessary to stop his attack and prevent further harm to my child." The officer looked over at the man who was now being checked by paramedics. He had a bruised throat, some scrapes from his encounter with the cereal display, and the kind of disoriented expression that suggested he was still trying to figure out exactly what had happened to him. For someone who had allegedly been attacked by a small woman using minimal force, he looked remarkably damaged. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said carefully, "I have to ask, do you have any training in self-defense? Military service, martial arts, anything like that?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, long enough for an experienced officer to notice, but brief enough that a casual observer might have missed it entirely. "I've had some basic self-defense training," she said finally. "I think any woman living alone with a child should know how to protect herself." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Officer Martinez had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was choosing their words very carefully. There was clearly more to Sarah's background than she was sharing, but she wasn't under arrest and had no obligation to provide her complete life history. The paramedics finished their examination of the alleged attacker and approached the officer. "He's got some bruising and he's pretty shaken up, but nothing that requires hospitalization," one of them reported. Honestly, for a guy his size to be taken down by someone her size, she'd have to be pretty well trained. Officer Martinez nodded and made notes in his pad. The physical evidence, witness statements, and his own observations were all pointing toward the same conclusion. Sarah had been the victim of an assault and had successfully defended herself. But the efficiency and effectiveness of her response suggested capabilities that went far beyond basic self-defense training. "Mrs." he began, realizing he hadn't gotten her full name yet. "Martinez," Sarah replied. "Sarah Martinez." She provided her driver's license and contact information with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with official procedures. The irony of their shared surname wasn't lost on either of them, and Officer Martinez smiled briefly as he copied down her information. "Any relation?" he asked with a kind of small talk that helped ease tension in difficult situations. "Different families," Sarah said with a slight smile of her own. "It's a pretty common name." As Officer Martinez continued his investigation, interviewing witnesses and taking statements, a pattern began to emerge that intrigued him. Everyone who had witnessed the confrontation agreed on the basic facts, but their descriptions of Sarah's actions varied widely. Some said she had fought back, others that she had defended herself, and a few used words like neutralized and controlled the situation that seemed oddly tactical for civilian witnesses. The most revealing interview came from James Patterson, a retired Marine who had been shopping with his wife when the incident occurred. Unlike the other witnesses, Patterson's description of what he had seen was precise and professional. "Officer," Patterson said quietly, "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I know what it looks like when someone with advanced combat training goes into action. That woman didn't just fight back. She executed a textbook takedown with the kind of precision you only get from serious military training." Officer Martinez looked across the store at Sarah, who was now sitting with her son near the customer service desk, helping him calm down from the traumatic experience. She looked like exactly what she claimed to be, a suburban mother who had been forced to defend herself and her child. But Patterson's assessment aligned with his own growing suspicions. "What kind of training are you talking about?" he asked the retired Marine. Patterson lowered his voice even further. "The kind they don't teach in weekend self-defense classes." The way she controlled that choke, the precision of her strikes, the way she managed distance and timing, that's special operations level training. I've seen Navy SEALs and Marine Force Recon operate, and what she did today would have impressed any of them. This revelation put Officer Martinez in a difficult position. Sarah was clearly the victim in this situation, and she had acted within her rights to defend herself and her child. But if she possessed advanced military training, it raised questions about whether her response had been proportional to the threat. The law recognized the right to self-defense, but it also required that the force used be reasonable given the circumstances. He approached Sarah again, this time with a different set of questions. "Mrs. Martinez, I want to be clear that you're not in any trouble here. You were the victim of an assault, and you had every right to defend yourself. But I didn't need to ask about your background. Several witnesses have suggested that your response showed more than basic self-defense training. Sarah looked at him steadily, and he could see her evaluating exactly how much information she was willing to share. I serve in the military, she said finally. I received training in various combat skills as part of my service. What branch? Officer Martinez asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Navy, Sarah replied, and left it at that. Officer Martinez waited to see if she would elaborate, but it was clear that she had no intention of providing additional details unless specifically asked. He made a decision to let the matter rest for the moment. The man who had assaulted her was clearly intoxicated, had initiated the confrontation, and had escalated it by grabbing her and making threats. Sarah's response, regardless of her training level, had been defensive rather than aggressive. The alleged attacker, whose name turned out to be Robert Shun, was arrested and charged with assault, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct. His blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit, and his history of similar incidents made it clear that this was part of a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. As the police concluded their investigation and began to clear the scene, Officer Martinez found himself thinking about Sarah Martinez and her carefully guarded background. He had encountered veterans before who preferred not to discuss their service, especially those who had seen combat or serve in specialized units. There were often good reasons for maintaining privacy about military service, particularly for those who had been involved in classified operations. But as he watched Sarah comforting her son and speaking quietly with store management about the incident, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a much larger story here than a simple case of self-defense. The precision of her actions, the way she had maintained complete control throughout the confrontation, and the almost casual efficiency with which she had neutralized a much larger opponent all suggested someone with extensive combat experience. Tommy Martinez looked up at his mother with a mixture of admiration and confusion that Officer Martinez found touching. It was clear that the boy had never seen this side of his mother before, and he was trying to process what he had witnessed. Sarah noticed his expression and knelt down to speak with him at eye level. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "Mom," Tommy said quietly. "How did you do that? How did you make that big man fall down?" Sarah paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people learn special skills to protect the people they love," she said. "I learned those skills a long time ago, and I hoped I would never have to use them. But when someone threatens my family, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the trust that children place in their parents. But Officer Martinez, watching from a distance, recognized the weight of the conversation. Sarah Martinez was clearly a woman with secrets, and today had forced her to reveal capabilities that she had probably hoped to keep hidden forever. As the family prepared to leave the store, Officer Martinez approached them one final time. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, "if you need anything, counseling resources, assistance with the legal proceedings, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact the department." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation." As they walked away, Officer Martinez found himself wondering what other secrets suburban America might be hiding. How many apparently ordinary people walking through shopping centers and attending PTA meetings carried backgrounds that would surprise their neighbors. Sarah Martinez had spent years building a quiet civilian life, but one afternoon had revealed that the warrior she used to be was never really gone, just carefully controlled and held in reserve for when it was truly needed. The questions about her true background would only grow more intense as word of the incident spread through their small community. #The truth emerges. The drive home from the grocery store was unusually quiet. Tommy sat in his car's seat, occasionally glancing at his mother in the rearview mirror with an expression that mixed curiosity with something approaching awe. Sarah focused on the familiar suburban streets, but her mind was racing with the implications of what had just happened. For 8 years, she had successfully maintained her cover as an ordinary civilian, but 30 seconds of combat had potentially unraveled everything she had worked to build. When they pulled into their driveway, Tommy finally broke the silence. "Mom, are you going to tell Dad what happened?" Sarah turned off the engine and sat for a moment, considering the question. David would be home from school within the hour, and there was no way to hide what had occurred. The incident would likely be in the local news, and their quiet neighborhood would be buzzing with gossip about the grocery store confrontation. More importantly, Tommy would undoubtedly want to share the dramatic story with his father. "Yes, sweetheart," she said finally. "Dad needs to know what happened today." As they entered their house, Sarah looked around at the comfortable, ordinary living space they had created together. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, Tommy's artwork decorated the refrigerator, and David's lesson plans were spread across the kitchen table where he had left them that morning. It was the picture of normal suburban life, and Sarah realized that she might be about to change everything. She helped Tommy with his afternoon snack and tried to maintain their usual routine, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation she would have to have with David. How do you tell someone you love that you've been living a fundamental lie for the entire duration of your relationship? How do you explain that the gentle, peaceful woman he married was actually someone trained to kill with her bare hands? When David's car pulled into the driveway at 3:30, Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She watched through the window as he gathered his teacher's bag and walked toward the house with the same easy smile he wore every day. In a few minutes, that smile might disappear forever. "Hey, beautiful," David said as he entered the kitchen, automatically moving to kiss Sarah hello. "How was your day?" Before Sarah could answer, Tommy launched into an excited retelling of the grocery store incident. His 8-year-old perspective focused on the dramatic elements, the scary man, his mother's amazing fighting skills, and the police investigation. David's expression shifted from casual interest to confusion to alarm as the story unfolded. "Wait, slow down, Tommy," David said, looking between his son and his wife. "Sarah, what happened?" Sarah took a deep breath and provided a more measured account of the incident, focusing on the facts and trying to minimize the more dramatic elements. But even her careful retelling couldn't hide the basic reality. She had single-handedly neutralized a much larger opponent with a level of skill that suggested extensive combat training. David listened in silence, his expression becoming more troubled as the story continued. When Sarah finished, he sat down heavily at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair in the gesture she recognized as his way of processing overwhelming information. "I don't understand," he said finally. Where did you learn to do that?" This was the moment Sarah had dreaded for 8 years. She looked at Tommy, who was watching both his parents with the keen attention that children pay to adult conversations they sense are important but don't fully understand. "Tommy," she said gently, "why don't you go upstairs and play with your Legos for a while?" "Dad, and I need to talk." Tommy started to protest, but something in his mother's tone told him that this wasn't the time to argue. He headed upstairs, though Sarah suspected he would try to listen from the landing, a suspicion that proved correct when she heard the telltale creaking of the floorboard that marked his favorite eavesdropping position. "Tommy, all the way to your room, please," she called, and waited until she heard his bedroom door close before turning back to David. David was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before, confusion mixed with hurt and what might have been the beginning of betrayal. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've known you for 9 years, and I've never seen you so much as raise your voice in anger. Today you apparently took down a man twice your size without breaking a sweat. So I'll ask again, where did you learn to do that?" Sarah sat down across from him at the table where they had shared thousands of meals, helped Tommy with homework, and made plans for their future together. The morning's lesson plans were still scattered across the surface, a reminder of the normal life they had been living just hours before. "I was in the Navy," she said simply. "I know that," David replied with a touch of frustration. "You told me you worked in communications. You said you spent most of your time at computer terminals." "That wasn't exactly true," Sarah admitted, feeling the weight of 8 years of deception settling between them like a physical presence. David was quiet for a long moment, processing this admission. What did you actually do in the Navy? Sarah looked down at her hands, noting the calluses that she had worked hard to soften over the years, but that still bore the subtle marks of someone who had spent countless hours handling weapons and climbing ropes. I was a Navy SEAL, she said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at her as if she had just announced that she was from another planet. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That's impossible. There are no female Navy SEALs. There weren't supposed to be, Sarah corrected. I was part of a classified program that ran from 2008 to 2016. Very small numbers, very quiet operations. Officially, we never existed. David stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the kitchen in the way he did when he was trying to work through a complex problem. Sarah had seen this behavior countless times when he was struggling with difficult students or challenging curriculum decisions, but never when the problem was their relationship. So for our entire marriage, he said slowly, you've been lying to me about who you are. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting it. I wasn't lying about who I am, she said. I was lying about who I used to be. The woman you married, the mother Tommy knows, that's all real. That's who I chose to become. But you let me believe you were just a regular person, David said, his voice rising slightly. You let me think I knew you, when really you're some kind of killer. Sarah supplied quietly. Is that what you're trying to say? David stopped pacing and really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Are you? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would shape their relationship going forward. Sarah considered her answer carefully, knowing that her response would determine whether their marriage would survive this revelation. I've killed people, David, she said finally. Not many, and never anyone who wasn't trying to kill me or my team first. But yes, I've taken lives in the line of duty. It was part of my job, and I was very good at my job. David sank back into his chair, looking overwhelmed by the weight of this information. God, Sarah, how many other things don't I know about you? Nothing else that matters, Sarah said urgently, reaching across the table to take his hand. He didn't pull away, which she took as an encouraging sign. Everything about our life together has been real. My feelings for you, my love for Tommy, my desire to build a peaceful life, all of that is genuine. The only thing I hid was my past. But it's a pretty significant past to hide, David pointed out. You're trained to kill people with your bare hands. You've seen combat. You've lived through things I can't even imagine. How do I process the fact that the woman I've been sleeping next to for 8 years could probably break my neck without working up a sweat? Sarah flinched at his words, but she couldn't argue with their accuracy. Because I would never hurt you, she said simply. Because every skill I learned, every mission I completed, every horrible thing I had to do, it all led me to the place where I could meet you and build this life. I left that world behind because I found something better. David was quiet for several minutes, staring at their joined hands on the table. When he looked up, his expression was troubled, but no longer angry. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? It was the question Sarah had been dreading most, because it went to the heart of her deepest fears. Because I was afraid, she admitted. I was afraid you'd see me differently. I was afraid you'd think I was dangerous or damaged, or not the kind of person you wanted to raise a child with. I was afraid you'd leave. So instead you decided to lie for 8 years. I decided to become the person I wanted to be, Sarah corrected. The person I am with you is real, David. She's just not the only person I've ever been. David stood up again, but this time his pacing seemed less agitated and more contemplative. I need some time to process this, he said finally. This is a lot. Sarah nodded, understanding that she was asking him to completely reframe his understanding of their relationship and her identity. I know it is, and I know I should have told you sooner. I never knew how. What else should I know? David asked, are there other secrets? Other aspects of your past that might surface? Sarah considered the question carefully. My service record is classified, and most of the people who know about the program are bound by the same security restrictions I am. Today was the first time since we've been together that I've had to use those skills. I hoped I never would again. But you're still the same person who learned those skills, David pointed out. The capacity is still there. Yes, Sarah agreed quietly. It always will be. But I've spent 8 years proving that I can choose when and how to use those abilities. Today, I use them to protect our son. I make the same choice again. David stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. Our son, he repeated. Tommy saw all of this happen. Yes, and he's going to have questions that we'll need to answer together. Questions like whether his mother is a secret agent or something. Sarah almost smiled at the reference to popular movies, but caught herself. Questions like why people sometimes have to do things they'd rather not do to protect the people they love. Questions about why his mother knows how to fight when most mothers don't. Questions about whether our family is safe. David sat back down, looking exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. Is our family safe, Sarah? Are there people from your past who might come looking for you? No, Sarah said firmly. I've been out for 8 years, and my separation was clean. The program I was part of officially ended, and most of the people involved have moved on to civilian life just like I have. What happened today was just bad luck, a random encounter with a drunk who picked the wrong target. But now other people know what you're capable of, David pointed out. That police officer, the witnesses, probably half the neighborhood by tomorrow. Your secret isn't secret anymore. Sarah had been trying not to think about this aspect of the situation, but David was right. Her carefully constructed cover identity had been blown in a very public way. People would ask questions, and some of those questions might be difficult to answer without revealing more than she was comfortable sharing. We'll figure it out, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure how. The important thing is that we're all safe, and Tommy is okay. David reached across the table and took her hand again, this time with more intention. I love you, Sarah, he said quietly. I'm confused and hurt, and I feel like I don't know you as well as I thought I did, but I love you. I just need some time to figure out how to reconcile the woman I married with this new information about who you used to be. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since the morning's incident. I love you too, she said, and I'm sorry I kept this from you for so long. I know it wasn't fair. We'll work through it, David said, though his tone suggested that the process wouldn't be easy. But, Sarah, no more secrets. If we're going to move forward, I need to know that you trust me enough to be completely honest. No more secrets, Sarah agreed, hoping that her past would allow her to keep that promise. Upstairs, they could hear Tommy moving around in his room, probably trying to process his own version of the day's events. They would need to sit down with him soon and provide explanations that an 8-year-old could understand and accept. But first, Sarah and David needed to figure out how to navigate their relationship with this new information between them. The foundation of their marriage had been shaken, but perhaps not destroyed. Whether they could rebuild, it would depend on their ability to reconcile the peaceful suburban life they had created with the reality of who Sarah had been before they met. It wouldn't be easy, but as Sarah looked at the man she loved struggling to understand her revelations, she felt cautiously hopeful that their relationship might be strong enough to survive the truth. Moving forward 3 weeks after the grocery store incident. Sarah stood in her kitchen making Tommy's lunch for school, trying to establish a sense of normalcy in their dramatically changed world. The physical routine was the same: sandwich, apple, cookies, juice box, but everything else had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The local newspaper had run a small story about the incident, describing it as a heroic mother's defense of her child, but thankfully avoiding any speculation about Sarah's military background. However, word had spread through their neighborhood with the inevitable speed of suburban gossip, and Sarah had become something of a local celebrity. Neighbors who had previously exchanged polite waves now approached her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity that made her profoundly uncomfortable. David emerged from upstairs, adjusting his tie as he prepared for another day of teaching high school English. Their relationship had entered a delicate period of reconstruction, marked by honest conversations that were sometimes difficult but ultimately healing. They were learning to navigate their marriage with this new information between them. And while it wasn't always easy, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about their progress. "How are you feeling about the meeting today?" David asked. Accepting the coffee, she handed him with a grateful smile. Sarah had been dreading this conversation since she received the call 2 days earlier. Commander Patricia Walsh, her former commanding officer, had requested a face-to-face meeting to discuss the implications of Sarah's very public display of her capabilities. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, and Sarah suspected it would be more than just a casual conversation between old colleagues. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "Pat doesn't make social calls, especially not to people who are supposed to be living quiet civilian lives. Something's going on." Tommy bounded into the kitchen with the irrepressible energy of an 8-year-old who had adapted to his family's new reality with remarkable resilience. The incident at the grocery store had become something of a badge of honor among his classmates, and he had appointed himself as the family's official storyteller, though Sarah and David had coached him on which details to share and which to keep private. "Mom, can you teach me how to do that thing you did to the bad man?" Tommy asked, innocently dropping a question that highlighted one of the ongoing challenges their family faced. "We've talked about this, sweetheart," Sarah said patiently. "Those aren't games or tricks. They're serious skills that I learned for a very specific job, and I hope you never need to use anything like them. But what if someone tries to hurt me?" Tommy persisted with the logical directness that made 8-year-olds such challenging debaters. David and Sarah exchanged a look over Tommy's head. This was a conversation they had been having regularly since the incident, trying to balance honesty with age-appropriate guidance. They had decided that Tommy should understand that his mother had special training without encouraging him to see violence as a solution to problems. "If someone tries to hurt you," David said, kneeling down at Tommy's eye level, "your job is to get away and find a grown-up who can help. Your mom's job is to protect our family, but your job is to be smart and safe." Tommy considered this seriously, then nodded with the acceptance that children show when they trust the adults in their lives to handle the complicated stuff. Okay, but it was still pretty cool. Sarah couldn't argue with that assessment, even though she wished the situation had never arisen. She helped Tommy gather his backpack and lunch, going through their morning routine while trying not to think about the unknown implications of her afternoon meeting. After David and Tommy left for their respective schools, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and her anxiety. She tried to focus on work, opening her laptop to review a logo design project for a local restaurant, but her mind kept drifting to possible reasons why Commander Walsh would want to meet. None of the scenarios she could imagine were particularly comforting. At 11 o'clock, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a crisp professional voice identified itself as belonging to Agent Jennifer Chun from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division. "Mrs. Martinez," Agent Chun said, "I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about the incident that occurred at Morrison's grocery store 3 weeks ago." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "I already spoke with the local police about that incident," she said carefully. "I'm not sure what additional information I could provide." "I understand your confusion," Agent Chin replied smoothly, "but we're interested in discussing some other matters that may be related to your background. Would this afternoon be convenient? Say around 2 o'clock. The timing was suspicious, exactly when Sarah was supposed to meet with Commander Walsh. Either this was an extraordinary coincidence, or forces beyond her understanding were converging on her carefully constructed civilian life. "I'm afraid I already have an appointment at 2, Sarah said, deciding that honesty was probably her best strategy. "With Commander Walsh?" Agent Chin asked, confirming Sarah's suspicion that this was anything but coincidental. "How did you know that?" "Mrs. Martinez, I think it would be beneficial for all parties involved if we could combine these meetings. Commander Walsh has agreed to join our conversation, if that's acceptable to you." Sarah realized that she was being maneuvered into something she didn't fully understand, and her instincts told her to be very careful about how she proceeded. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person," Agent Chin said. "But I can assure you that you're not in any trouble, and we're hoping you might be willing to help us with a matter of national security. The phrase, national security, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had hoped never to hear those words again in connection with her own life. I'm retired from that world, she said firmly. I'm a civilian now. We understand that, and we respect your decision to leave military service, Agent Shin replied. But sometimes circumstances arise that require the expertise of people with your particular skill set. We're hoping you'll at least hear what we have to say. Sarah found herself trapped between her desire to protect her family's peaceful life and a growing sense that events were moving beyond her control, whether she participated or not. Where do you want to meet? The Starbucks on 5th and Main downtown. 2 o'clock. Commander Walsh will be there, and I'll be the woman in the navy blue suit reading the Wall Street Journal. After Agent Shun hung up, Sarah sat staring at her phone, feeling the familiar weight of forces beyond her control pressing in on her life. She had spent 8 years building walls between her military past and her civilian present, and in the space of 3 weeks, those walls were crumbling. She called David at school, knowing that he was probably in class, but needing to hear his voice. "Sarah," he answered after several rings, sounding concerned. "Is everything okay?" "Not exactly," she admitted, and filled him in on the morning's phone call. David was quiet for a moment. "Do you think this is connected to what happened at the grocery store?" "It has to be. The timing is too perfect for coincidence." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of a stress headache. "I'm sorry, David. I know we agreed no more secrets, but I think my past is about to complicate our lives in ways I can't predict or control." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to meet with them and find out what they want," Sarah said. "But I want you to know that whatever they're offering, my answer is no. I'm not going back to that life. What if they don't give you a choice?" It was a question Sarah had been trying not to ask herself. "Then we'll deal with whatever comes next as a family. But I won't let them pull me back into operations. I have too much to lose now." "I love you," David said quietly. "Whatever this is about, we'll figure out together." After hanging up, Sarah spent the next few hours trying to focus on normal activities while her mind raced through possibilities. By the time she arrived at the designated Starbucks, she had prepared herself for almost any scenario except the one that actually unfolded. Commander Walsh was sitting at a corner table, looking exactly as Sarah remembered: steel gray hair, penetrating blue eyes, and the kind of ramrod posture that announced military service from across a room. Seated across from her was a woman in her 30s wearing a navy blue suit and reading the Wall Street Journal, confirming her identity as Agent Shin. "Sarah." Commander Walsh stood to greet her with a warm smile that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "You look well. Civilian life agrees with you." "Commander," Sarah replied, accepting the offered handshake. "I wish I could say this was a pleasant surprise." Agent Shin introduced herself with the kind of professional courtesy that revealed nothing about her true intentions. She was Asian American, probably in her early 30s, with the alert demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with complex and potentially dangerous situations. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Agent Shin began once they were all seated. "I want to start by emphasizing that you're not in any trouble, and we're not here to recruit you for active service. We simply need your expertise on a matter that touches on your former area of specialization." "Which was?" Sarah asked, curious about how much they actually knew about her classified service record. "Counterterrorism operations, specifically infiltration and extraction in hostile environments," Commander Walsh replied. "Your record indicates exceptional performance in some very challenging situations." Sarah waited for them to continue, unwilling to volunteer information until she understood what they were really after. Years of military service had taught her the value of letting the other party reveal their position first. 3 days ago, Agent Shun continued, "We received credible intelligence about a terrorist cell operating in the Pacific Northwest. They're planning something significant, and they've been specifically recruiting individuals with military training to help with security and tactical planning." "There are a lot of veterans in the Pacific Northwest," Sarah observed. "What does this have to do with me?" Commander Walsh pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a surveillance photograph. In it, A woman with dark hair was meeting with two men in what appeared to be a coffee shop. The quality was poor, but there was something familiar about the woman's posture and bearing. We believe this woman is a former military operative who has been helping the terror cell with operational planning, Agent Shin explained. The problem is that we can't get anyone close enough to confirm her identity or gather intelligence about their plans. Sarah studied the photograph more carefully, and a chill ran down her spine as recognition dawned. "That's Maria Santos," she said quietly. "You know her?" Commander Walsh asked, though her expression suggested she had already known this would be Sarah's reaction. "We served together," Sarah confirmed. "Same program, same training. But Maria disappeared during our last operation in Syria. We assumed she was killed when her position was overrun." "Apparently not," Agent Chun said grimly. "And now she's using her training to help terrorists plan an attack on American soil. We need someone who knows her, someone who understands how she thinks and operates, to help us get close enough to stop this." Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. "You're asking me to come out of retirement to hunt down a former teammate." "We're asking you to help us prevent a terrorist attack," Commander Walsh corrected. "The cell Maria is working with has access to explosives and has been conducting surveillance on several high-value targets, including schools and government buildings." The mention of schools hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about Tommy sitting in his third-grade classroom, trusting that the adults in his life would keep him safe from the kind of violence that existed in other parts of the world. "How long would this take?" she asked, hating herself for even considering their request. "We estimate 2 to 3 weeks for the initial infiltration and intelligence-gathering phase," Agent Shin replied. "If we're successful in identifying the full scope of their operation, the extraction phase could be completed within days." "And if I say no?" "Then we try other approaches," Commander Walsh said. "But, Sarah, you know as well as I do that Maria was one of the best operatives in the program. Without someone who understands her capabilities and methods, our chances of success decrease significantly." Sarah thought about her conversation with David that morning, about her promise that she wouldn't let them pull her back into operations. She thought about Tommy asking why his mother knew how to fight when other mothers didn't, and about the peaceful life they had built together as a family. But she also thought about other families, other children who would be in danger if a terrorist attack succeeded. The skills she had tried so hard to leave behind might be the only thing standing between innocent people and the kind of violence she had seen too much of during her years of service. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Unfortunately, time is something we don't have much of," Agent Shin replied. "Intelligence suggests they're moving toward operational phase within the next 2 weeks. I need to discuss this with my husband," Sarah said firmly. "I won't make a decision that affects my family without consulting them." Commander Walsh nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. The woman I remember would never abandon her responsibilities to her family, even for a mission of national importance." "Give me 24 hours, Sarah requested. "Agreed," Agent Chun said, standing and offering her business card. "But, Sarah, if you decide to help us, we'll need your answer by tomorrow afternoon. After that, we'll have to proceed with alternative plans that are significantly less likely to succeed." As Sarah drove home through the familiar suburban streets, she realized that the grocery store incident had been just the beginning. Her carefully constructed civilian identity was unraveling, and she was being pulled back toward a world she had hoped never to see again. The question now was whether she could find a way to fulfill her obligations to national security while protecting the family and the life she had worked so hard to build. The conversation with David would be the most difficult one yet, because this time she would be asking him to support a decision that could put everything they had created together at risk. But as she pulled into their driveway and saw Tommy's bike lying on the front lawn where he had abandoned it after school, she knew that protecting innocent children, including her own, might be worth any sacrifice required.